remembers Fire Festival? Anybody remember Fire Festival? If you don't remember it, it was a luxury music festival that was supposed to happen on an island in the Bahamas in 2017. And people paid thousands of dollars to go to this event, stay in luxurious accommodations, eat gourmet food, and enjoy live performances from like Migos, Pusha T, Blink-182, Major Lazer. Now, unfortunately, for the people who paid thousands of dollars to attend, what they got were porta-johns, small tents, cheese sandwiches, and no live performances because literally every artist backed out. It was a total disaster. And what quickly emerged was that the whole thing was essentially a scam. And it led to countless news stories and 2 full-length documentaries that eventually led to the event's founder, a guy named Billy McFarland, being sentenced to 6 years in prison for fraud. Now, Billy McFarland got out of prison after serving 4 years, and you guys, do you know what happened last year? That same guy, Billy McFarland, announced that he was selling tickets for Fire Festival 2 in Playa del Carmen, Mexico. Despite the fact that the first Fire Festival was a total disaster, you'll never believe people bought tickets for the second one. I'm going to give you 1,000 guesses as to whether or not the second Fire Festival happened or not. Anybody want to guess? No, it did not. It didn't happen. We live in a society where sometimes it just doesn't seem to matter if we're telling the truth. From Billy McFarland with the Fire Festival, to Bernie Madoff, to Samuel Bankman-Fried from FTX, or Elizabeth Holmes and her blood testing company Theranos, it seems like honesty and integrity have become like optional features. I'm old enough to remember a time when public figures would get caught lying or doing something that they shouldn't do, and they'd issue a tearful apology, and they'd tell us that they'd work on themselves, and then they'd lay low for a year or two, and then go on the apology tour as they reemerged into public view. These days, it doesn't seem to matter if you're a movie star, an athlete, a coach, a politician, or yes, sometimes even a pastor, and you just don't accept responsibility for anything that you've done. You don't apologize for anything. And you just blame it all on the haters. And so the question for us is, does integrity matter to us anymore? Note that I didn't say, does integrity matter? What I said was, does integrity matter to us? Does it matter to us if we tell the truth? Does it matter to us if we keep our word? Does it matter to us if we take responsibility when we've messed up? Integrity is very hard to maintain, and it asks a lot of us. So if nobody notices or nobody cares when we maintain integrity, does it matter? The answer to that question, by the way, is yes. Integrity matters. Integrity matters a lot. Integrity matters to God, and as His people, it needs to matter to us. If we don't have integrity, our relationships will collapse. If we don't have integrity, our families will fall apart. If we don't have integrity, our entire society will devolve and degrade until we live in like a Hunger Games style dystopia where nothing matters except our own interests and our own flexible definitions of honesty and truth. Now, if you were here 2 weeks ago, you know that we started a new series called God Intended It for Good. And this series is a study of the life of Joseph from the book of Genesis. And here's where we left off at the end of the first week. Joseph's brothers had sold him into slavery. And what they did after they sold him into slavery was they killed a goat, they took Joseph's coat, and they dipped it in blood. And then they presented it to their father. And their father, his name is Jacob. And Jacob recognized Joseph's coat, Joseph's robe, and he saw the blood on it, and he was convinced that his beloved son was dead. Now, rather than have integrity and tell their father the truth, what did the brothers do? They allowed their father to suffer the pain of believing that his son was dead, even though they knew he wasn't. And that's bad. Let me just quickly say, kids, don't do that at home. And by the way, while I'm at it, if you have your kids with you for this service, I'm just going to tell you up front, this is a good week for your kids to check out our outstanding kids ministry programs, because we're going to talk about some things in the Joseph story. Okay, that disclaimer stated, let's jump into the Joseph story and see where things are at after he's been sold into slavery. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Well, this all seems fine, maybe even pretty good for Joseph. But there's a problem that emerges. Let's jump back into the story. Now, Joseph was well-built and handsome. It's a struggle some of us bear. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." For those of you who maybe aren't understanding the subtlety of what Scripture is saying here, she wasn't asking to take a nap. But this is Joseph, but he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Now, in this story, we actually never see a name attached to Potiphar's wife. There are later Jewish commentators who say that her name was Zuleika, but that's almost definitely a name that was made up after the fact. All I know is Zuleika Joseph a little too much. And as the story says, she finds Joseph very attractive, and she invites him to have sex with her. But Joseph says no. Why? Because Joseph is a person of integrity. He knows that having sex with her would be a sin against God, so he doesn't do it. Remember just a couple of moments ago, I encouraged you to check your kids into our amazing kids ministry programs? If you didn't take me up on that, enjoy your car ride home. Okay, now, I don't know how many of you throughout your life have been a part of a high school ministry program, but let me tell you, this story gets preached to high schoolers all the time because, obviously. So if you've never heard this story before, you might not know that what commonly gets preached with this story is that Joseph resisted the temptation presented by this very seductive and attractive woman because he really wanted to give in to the temptation, but he didn't. And that's a fine moral of the story, but at least as I read it, that's not actually what the story says. Now, I'm not saying for sure that we know how Joseph felt about her, because the Bible doesn't say one way or another. The Bible's pretty silent about Joseph's perspective about how he felt about Potiphar's wife. We don't know if he looked at her and was like, I like you more as a friend, or if he looked at her and he was like, Sade. We don't know what his response was. And here's why I bring that up. I'm not convinced that the way he felt about her actually matters all that much to the story. See, a lot of people seem to think that it's a big part of the story, how Joseph felt about her, and I actually don't think that's right. Whether or not he was highly tempted is not what's most important in the story. The most important thing in the story is that regardless of how he felt, he maintained his integrity and his faithfulness to God. And what I believe this shows us is that integrity doesn't depend on my circumstances. Your integrity, my integrity, is a constant thing. Our integrity doesn't flex and bend around whatever situation we're in. Let me explain what I mean with a little bit of an illustration. Many of us have a reasonable sense of the things in our lives that we will do, that we're committed to. I will be honest. I will live up to my commitments. I will pay my bills. And I think a lot of us have a pretty good sense of the things we will not do. I will not steal. I will not cheat on my spouse. I will not lie to people. Here's the problem. So often, what we will and won't do, we decide based on our situation. So we let our circumstances decide what we will and won't do. I mean, I generally will be honest, but I mean, we all lie a little bit to get out of paying some taxes, am I right? Or I will honor my commitments, I mean, unless a better one comes along. Or I will generally return the shopping cart to the grocery store, unless I'm parking too far away. Okay, I'll admit that's not so much integrity, but here's the thing. If you have like an EastLake Church bumper sticker on your car, and you do not return the grocery cart, you are not doing our church any favors. Return the cart. But when we live in a way that our circumstances determine what we will and won't do, we're going to get in so much trouble in our lives. Because we're not going to make good decisions under pressure. If we leave our big decisions up to how we feel about them in the moment, we're going to make decisions we regret. So if we don't want to have regrets about our financial decisions, we shouldn't wait until we're in a financial bind to decide if we're going to have integrity in how we deal with money. If we don't want to have regrets about what we've done with our body, well, we shouldn't wait until we're experiencing temptation to decide whether or not we're going to maintain sexual purity. If we don't want to have regrets about being dishonest, we shouldn't wait until we're under pressure to determine whether or not we're going to tell the truth. Here's my point, and I believe that this is illustrated by Joseph's story. We have to decide what we will do and what we won't do in advance. See, that's what Joseph did. He didn't wait until he was in a pressurized circumstance to make a decision about what he would and wouldn't do. Before he was in that situation, he already had a clear sense. This is what I will do. This is what I will not do. And what I'm saying to you is this. Make your decisions in advance about who you are, what you believe, and where you draw the lines. When you do that, you put yourself in so much better of a position to maintain your integrity. And clearly, this is what Joseph has done in his own story. Now, does having integrity guarantee that nothing bad will happen to Joseph? Let's take a look. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She, that's Potiphar's wife, caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar's wife, in this rejection that she experiences, she decides, I'm going to settle a score here. I'm going to get revenge. So she tosses her own integrity out the window and goes on the attack. And what she does is follow the same playbook that so many of us will follow when we're compromising our integrity. And the first thing she does when she's lacking integrity is this: attack an easy target. I don't know if you remember earlier in this story, there was one thing that Joseph couldn't do in Potiphar's house. And it was he couldn't attend to the food. Why is that? Because Joseph is a Hebrew, and the Egyptians look down on the Hebrews. They believe that they are unclean. Of course, Potiphar's wife knows this. So what does she do? She engages in a little bit of casual racism. She says that Hebrew slave to her husband. See, she goes after an easy target because she knows, look, people are willing to believe the worst about someone they're already inclined to dislike. And then she goes to the next logical move, which is blame someone else. Did you notice? She put the blame on Potiphar all of a sudden. Not only was it that Hebrew slave, but it's that Hebrew slave you brought us. When we compromise our integrity, what do we want to do? We want to find somebody else to blame because it could never be our fault, right? Then the third step is a classic, which is lie about the details. She just makes up a story. As soon as I screamed for help, she did not. He left his cloak beside me. He didn't leave it, you pulled it off of him. And ran out of the house. That's the only part of the story that's true. Joseph did run out of the house. Everything else was a lie. And we're all capable of compromising our integrity like this. And what I'd say to all of us is that when we see ourselves doing any of those three things, attacking an easy target, blaming somebody else, lying about the details, we might want to stop for a moment and check ourselves because God might be revealing to us we're compromising our integrity here. Now, in her case, what she does with this lie is she puts Joseph in a terrible spot, even though he's completely innocent. He didn't do what he was accused of. I mean, think about it. She seems to have proof. She's got Joseph's cloak. She's got it in her hand. It's a pretty compelling story, right? I mean, he tried to attack me, and when I screamed, he ran away. How else would I possibly have his cloak? Anybody who heard the story and looked at the cloak in her hand would believe it, right? Does anybody notice anything in the Joseph story here? Joseph's clothing is a recurring theme. Think back to week 1. In week 1, Joseph's brothers used Joseph's own clothing to convince their father of a lie. And the lie was that Joseph was dead. Now, it was the coat of many colors, but they dipped it in blood, and they showed it to their father and said, look. And then he believed the lie. Now, Potiphar's wife, she's running the same play. Different robe, but the same idea. She's got this lie about Joseph, and she presents it in a very convincing way, and she holds up his clothes as evidence and says, look. And they've got to be thinking to themselves, well, she has to be telling the truth, right? How else would she have his robe? Sometimes the lies that are told about people seem true, but that doesn't mean they are. And Joseph is going to suffer the consequences of this lie that everybody believes is true. And what that shows us is this: integrity comes with a cost. We sometimes think, here's the deal. If I maintain my integrity, if I do the right thing, people aren't going to gossip about me. People aren't going to say things about me that aren't true. And if you've ever said that, aw, that's adorable. Because life doesn't work that way. People are going to make up stories about you, and you're going to wonder, where on earth did that come from? Trust me, I've been in ministry for a while. I've heard crazy things about myself where I've gone, I have no idea where that story comes from. I had a silly one happen to me quite a while ago. After I graduated high school, I went to the University of Miami School of Music, go Canes, and after I was there for a couple of months, somebody in my hometown ran into my sister and said that they were so excited to hear that I was the new bass player for the Miami Sound Machine. You can imagine how surprised my sister was to hear this, because I was never the bass player for the Miami Sound Machine. Don't get me wrong. Gloria Estefan is a saint who is also the queen of Miami. I will not tolerate anything negative said about her in my presence. And they're an amazing band. I never would have been good enough to get in. But ultimately, more to the point, is there anything about me that says conga? And when it's a silly story like that, it's not a big deal. It's kind of funny. But when the lie goes after your character, when the lie goes after your honesty, when the lie goes after your conduct, that really hurts. And for Joseph, maintaining his integrity didn't keep him from suffering consequences. We jump back into the story. When his master, and again, that's Potiphar, heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Joseph, he hadn't done anything wrong, but he wound up being treated as if he did. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's how it works sometimes. Sometimes bad things happen to us even when we've done the right things the right way. God doesn't promise that you'll never deal with negativity if you live with integrity. Do it anyway. Live with integrity anyway. In Joseph's case, God redeemed this circumstance, as we saw in the story, by giving him favor in the prison. In your case, when you deal with these circumstances, I don't know how it will work out. But I will say this: I trust God for the outcome. And did you notice what Joseph didn't do in prison? He didn't try to get even. He didn't try to settle scores. He just continued to live in integrity and left the rest to God. And that's because integrity speaks the truth, but doesn't seek revenge. Now, I want to be super clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that we remain silent in the face of evil. Keeping silent about wrongdoing has allowed horrible things to happen to people in the world and horrible things to happen to people in the church. So don't misunderstand me here. Integrity doesn't remain silent in the face of abuse, manipulation, violence, or wrongdoing. Part of integrity is having the strength to speak up and establish the truth of the facts, even if it costs us. But what integrity doesn't do is settle scores and get revenge. Think about Joseph. He's in the prison. Can you imagine the things he could have said about Potiphar's wife? He could have been walking around like Kanye, "We want prenup," right? He could have said anything about Potiphar's wife and get even with her, but he didn't. Why? He focused on living with integrity even though he was being punished for something he didn't do. And there's something else that's really important that we don't want to miss that's going on in this story. See, so often when we read the Old Testament, we see these stories. Again, the Old Testament is the portion of the Bible written about the period of time before the birth of Jesus. We look at these stories as if they're isolated events, and they're not. See, the Old Testament is doing something that we should never miss. It's constantly pointing us towards Jesus. And the story that we've just read, it's not just about Joseph. It's actually pointing towards Jesus. Here's what I mean. God is showing us having integrity and doing his will, it doesn't protect us from every bad thing that comes our way. Jesus lived in total integrity. And he was crucified, even though he was completely innocent. And what will really blow your mind if you look at it is if you go to John chapter 19, what you'll see is after they took Jesus to be executed, The Romans took his clothes. See, just like the Joseph story, clothing in the midst of a lie shows up again. And that's not a subtle point. That's not like a fluke. It's the Bible signaling us, hey, this Joseph story connects back to Jesus. See, Jesus maintained his integrity even when he was falsely accused. Here's what it says in Matthew 26. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they didn't find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. Jesus was surrounded by all of these false accusers who made up all of these lies about him. He could have, as fully God and fully man, wiped out every single one of them with a word. He could have settled every score. He could have gotten his revenge. But he didn't. Why? Because integrity doesn't seek revenge. And Jesus knows he's going to be vindicated on the cross. He will overcome evil, but he's going to do it in a way that reflects the wisdom of Romans 12:21, which simply says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We have a couple of weeks left in the Joseph story that we'll be going through as a church. And I don't want to spoil the end of the Joseph story for you, but also don't really know if it's a spoiler alert if I'm talking about how Genesis ends. The book's been out for thousands of years. You've had a chance to read it. I'm not exactly giving away the end of Toy Story 5 here. But Joseph's story is not going to end in a prison. God will vindicate him. Joseph's responsibility is simply to be faithful and maintain his integrity. And as we look from Joseph's story to the story of Jesus, as Jesus followers, we want to be more like Jesus. And Jesus modeled perfect integrity. And we'll never achieve perfect integrity because we're imperfect people. But if we're followers of Jesus, we are to seek after that. We are to be people who speak the truth, people who live up to our commitments, people who do the right thing the right way at the right time. And sometimes we'll bump into the hurts of a broken world, and things will be said about us that aren't true. And so the question is, what's your job? What's my job in the middle of that? Maintain your integrity. Some of you are walking through a season right now where you're feeling the pressure to compromise your integrity. You're feeling the pressure to compromise your integrity because it's just too costly to remain honest, to say the right thing, to do the right thing. It's going to hurt so much if you do. Do it anyway. Maintain your integrity. Some of you are in a season right now where you're going through something like what Joseph did, where there are things being said about you that aren't true. There are lies being told about you, and you feel like there's nothing you can do about it. You want to fight back. I would just point you to Joseph, and I would point you to Jesus and say, maintain your integrity. Speak truth, establish the facts, but don't seek revenge. Because God is asking you to maintain your integrity. And to some of you, I will say, you might be in a situation where you're tempted to be the person who tells the story about somebody else. Maybe because you feel hurt. And you're tempted to compromise your integrity and be the person who makes up a story about somebody else. Don't do it. God is calling us to be people of integrity, to live lives of integrity. And what we can do is trust. God knows the truth. God values our integrity. And we can rely on the fact that just like Joseph, even if we're going through a difficulty, he's not done writing the story for us. There was more to be written in Joseph's story, and there's more to be written in your story as well. Will you stand with me? In a moment, we're going to worship with one final song. And it's a song that speaks about this idea of God turning things around. There being hard circumstances, bad circumstances, difficult circumstances. And God takes what the enemy meant for evil and he turns it for good. And so our responsibility in the middle of that is to remain faithful. To remain faithful to God's calling on our lives, to remain faithful to the truth of who we are, and to remain faithful to the truth of who we are as followers of God. And so I don't know what you might be walking through in your life right now, what you've been through, maybe what you're heading into. But I just want to call you to maintain your integrity. Be that person who trusts God for the outcome. Because I believe that if you do, you will see a victory. Will you pray with me? God, I thank you that you call us to follow you. And as we follow you, Lord, you're calling us into a place where we need to walk in integrity. And so, Lord, give us the strength to do that. Give us the strength to admit when we've blown it, to confess our weaknesses and our failings, and to seek healing. And Lord, I also pray that when we walk through the seasons of being falsely accused, that we would have our eyes on you, to know that you see the truth, you know the truth, you care for us, and you will make the outcome right. Lord, we trust you. We place our lives in your hands because we love you and we know that you turn what the enemy meant for evil for good. It's in your mighty name we pray.